Hi.
Hi, everybody. We're in a new chapter of In Search of Christian Freedom, chapter 10, Shepherds of the Flock. In the previous chapter, of course, Paul is being brought forth as an example of how to exemplify the law of love in Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And now, of course, that means the mind of Ray and many others will go to, well, what is Paul imitating? Paul is imitating Christ himself.
Mm.
So Ray suitably starts this chapter, Shepherds of the Flock, with a famous passage from Matthew 18, verse 12. If a certain man comes to have 100 sheep, and one of them gets strayed, will he not leave the 99 upon the mountains, and set out on a search for the one that is straying? And if he happens to find it, I certainly tell you, he rejoices more over it than over the 99 that have not strayed.
Speaking of his sheep, Jesus gave the assurance that they would know his voice, adding, "A stranger they will by no means follow, but will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers." In reading the scriptures, we do come to know the voice of the true shepherd, learn to distinguish it from the voices that do not ring true. His voice expresses itself in a way that harmonizes perfectly with the description he gave of himself in this call to his sheep in Matthew 11, verses 28 and 30. "Come to me, all you who are toiling and loaded down, and I will refresh you. Take my yoke upon you and become my disciples, for I am mild-tempered and lowly in heart, and you will find refreshment for your souls. For my yoke is kindly and my load is light."
Today, as in the past, there are people in many places who are leaving religious affiliations of long standing, doing so for the very reason that they do not hear the voice of the Good Shepherd in the proclamations of their respective religions, do not hear the call to refreshment and relief, but hear instead a strident call for total submission to human authority. The voice they hear is out of harmony with the instruction Christ gave his disciples in saying, "You know that in the world rulers lord it over their subjects, and their great men make them feel the weight of authority, but it shall not be so with you." That being Matthew 20, 25, 26.
Right. And then Ray continues, "Sometime after I wrote Crisis of Conscience, a friend loaned me a copy of an earlier book with a notably similar title, A Question of Conscience. The author, Charles Davis, had been born in England of parents of the Roman Catholic faith. He states that, in his youth, quote, "The claim of the Roman Church to be the one true church was taken for granted as an assured fact. The Catholic Church remained for me, right into adult life, an unquestioned and unchallengeable part of reality. It dominated my world." That's the end of the quote. From the age of 15, he pursued an ecclesiastical vocation as his goal in life. Though our religious heritage seemed worlds apart, Jehovah's Witnesses resembling a small pond in contrast to the vast ocean of Catholicism, I felt a bond of mutual experience, having held those very same feelings regarding the religion of my heritage.
Charles Davis spent over 20 years in the priesthood and became the leading Catholic theologian of Great Britain. He traveled widely in giving lectures both in Britain and overseas. Then in 1966, he decided to leave the religion of his birth. Whatever other parallels with my own experience that had impressed me, it was in reading his reasons for taking this major step, abandoning a belief system and a religious career that had spanned his entire life, that I felt the closest affinity, felt most deeply moved. He wrote, this is a direct quote, "I remain a Christian, but I have come to see that the church as it exists and works at present is an obstacle in the lives of committed Christians I know and admire. It is not the source of values they cherish and promote. On the contrary, they live and work in a constant tension and opposition to it. For me, Christian commitment is inseparable from concern for truth and concern for people. I do not find either of these represented by the official church. There is concern for authority at the expense of truth, and I am constantly saddened by instances of the damage done to persons by workings of an impersonal and unfree system. Further, I do not think that the claim the church makes as an institution rests upon any adequate biblical and historical basis. That's the end of the quote.
Ray says, in a parallel way, it was not the realization that errors existed within the Watchtower organization's teachings that most seriously affected me, for I did not feel that I could expect perfection when I myself was imperfect. It was primarily the spirit manifest that most deeply disturbed me, for I saw a similar concern for authority at the expense of truth, and an accompanying damage done to persons by workings of an impersonal and unfree system. Concern for authority clearly overshadowed concern for people.
There are among Jehovah's Witnesses, both in this country and in other countries, many, many persons for whom I feel true affection. I can honestly say that there are those still associated with that organization whom I admire. But I admire them for what they are as persons, for I am convinced that they are what they are, not because of the organization in which they find themselves, but in many respects, in spite of the organization. The qualities and spirit they themselves have are not reflective of that which comes down from the official organization. As Charles Davis put it, quote, it is not the source of values they cherish and promote, speaking of course of the Roman Catholic magisterium and authority. It's not the source of the values they cherish and promote in their dealings with others, and their conscientious effort to hold to biblical principles and exemplify Christian qualities often creates inner tensions for them for that very reason. They must, I believe, feel an uneasy sense of risk whenever they express themselves on certain issues.
Mm-hmm. That last sentence rings very true to me, because when I was a witness, up until those challenges were presented to you and to me, some of them, but I became aware of them, I was just kind of going along merrily as a witness. I was quite happy to be a witness. But when those questions and those concerns were presented, I knew I couldn't really freely talk to anyone about them. I had put out a few very tentative feelers and got bad reaction, and that scared me off. Mm-hmm. So this uneasy sense of risk, mm-hmm. I think the fact that it existed was what made me think there was something wrong. Why should I feel uneasy and at risk just asking concerns and questions mm-hmm. that other people have?
Yeah. By the way, Ray in the footnote makes note of the fact that he had thought of calling Crisis of Conscience a question of conscience, and yet didn't know about the existence of this other book about a parallel situation. But he ended up calling Crisis of Conscience its title we're all familiar with. But Charles Davis's experience, which later came to light through his friend, I also read that book during that time. I can't remember if it was just before I left or during the leaving process, and being, like Ray, struck by the parallels of how all religious authorities and certainly large organizations function, like corporations in the secular world, in the business world. Yeah. The next segment is entitled, What Kind of Shepherding Would the Good Shepherd Require? You wouldn't think we'd have to ask that question. What kind of shepherding is the next subhead in the next video. We'll see you then.